In our last discussion, we looked at the darker side of Romanticism. Romanticism being that literary movement that emerges as a reaction against the Enlightenment. And if, as those who were prominent in the Enlightenment were correct, and that the human mind itself is capable of understanding the world and going forward and shaping culture and creating insightful works of philosophical literature, what happens if the human mind goes off the rails, so to speak? What happens, or how should we think about the times in which people become obsessed, self-destructively obsessed, as Ahab does in the novel Moby Dick, literally taking himself and everyone down with the ship, except of course our narrator, Ishmael? How should we understand those moments? So Romanticism recognizes that there is an idea that the world exists outside of just the mind, and that other capacities of the human mind deserve recognition. Things that can't necessarily be categorized as reason or intellect or logic. Things like imagination and emotions, and the sort of wordless experience of being overwhelmed by the beauty of something, what the Romantics think of as the sublime, or feeling like you've been transported out of your body when you're reading a work of literature, that feeling of almost having your breath taken away. The Romantics recognize then that the mind is bigger than just the experience of intellect and reason and rationality. And this takes the multiple forms in Romanticism. Sometimes it's going to take the form of the transcendentalist thinkers, whom we'll be turning to in our next discussion. It might take the form of sort of the bigness of Walt Whitman's poetry. It might take the form of William Wordsworth reflecting on the beauties of nature. You know, the babbling creek down near Tintern Abbey in his famous poem by the same name. So it can take multiple forms, but it can also take a darker form, as we looked at in the excerpts from Moby Dick. And as we will see today, one of its darkest forms, what's called the Gothic. There's something appealing about the Gothic, right? I've taught classes here at the college themed entirely on Gothic literature. And it's not just the moment from the Romantic period in which the Gothic develops as a tangible subgenre of inside the Romantic period. But the Gothic seems to endure well beyond the Romantic period, into the realistic period, into the modernist period, into the postmodern and contemporary eras. There are still Gothic works that are being created today. There's something really interesting and appealing in exploring the darker side of humanity, or the part where it feels like humanity is spiraling out of control. And when I've taught the courses on the Gothic here at the college, I get many students who sign up for them because there's something about it that draws them to that topic. Monster movies and ghost stories and science run amok are all themes, the paranormal, the supernatural, the occult, devil figures, right? Witchcraft and wizardry and all of those sorts of ideas that seem to connect back to the Gothic have a strong appeal to the human psyche. And we like stories that explore that. One of the things that I'll have to ask you to consider in this week is, why do we find those stories so interesting? What is it about those stories that draw us in? So usually, when we're talking about the Gothic in a general artistic sense, we're talking about something that has a lot to do with mood and atmosphere. The Gothic emerges in Europe, and it's initially connected to a certain type of architecture. If you look up like Gothic cathedrals, this is something that emerges before the Romantic period. And you can probably imagine what feels like Gothic architecture simply by the experiences that you've had by seeing Gothic architecture inside, either sort of like horror movies or Gothic movies, or even something like, the conventional description or appearance of the Hogwarts castle from the Harry Potter series. Kind of gives you that sense of what the Gothic looks like. The Gothic architecture is highly ornamental. It's not purely utilitarian, right? A utilitarian architecture is just what is necessary in order to make the architectural property function. It's functional architecture. But the Gothic is a highly ornamental style of architecture, meaning that there are embellishments and flourishes that are added to the architecture that make it, that are not designed to be utilitarian. They're designed purely for aesthetic reasons. Some of these things might include arches and vaulted ceilings, points on roofs that aren't necessary, spires on top of the roofs, stained glass windows, a strong emphasis on verticality, right? It's built upwards as opposed to, a more utilitarian structure might have a more horizontal structure, right? Because, gravity keeps us down, and putting everything on one level is much more accessible as opposed to steep staircases that make things inaccessible. There might be gargoyles, right? Those are ornamental figures made out of cement on the outside of buildings, often to scare away or to inspire fear. The architecture might also include something like, dusty, musty basements or dungeons or secret passageways, right? We can all imagine the list of the things that might show up inside a sort of Gothic work of art. This became the setting for stories that reflected the mood and atmosphere of the Gothic. So what are the sort of moods and atmospheres associated with Gothic literature? Well, we mentioned last time that dark romanticism is interested in exploring the darker sides of human psychology, but I made the distinction at the time that dark romanticism and the Gothic are often conflated as if they're the same thing. But I think it's more important to recognize that the Gothic always has characteristics of the dark romanticism, but dark romanticism does not always have the characteristics of the Gothic. That's probably a good separation for us as we consider these sorts of things. In other words, the Gothic is a subsidiary of dark romanticism, not it's not the inverse, right? So what are some of the atmospheric or mood elements associated with the Gothic? Well, horror definitely is a central idea associated with the Gothic. The darker side of humanity, as we mentioned last time, but it's also more about perversions of nature. Right? What makes the novel Frankenstein a work of Gothic literature and not just a dark romanticism is the emphasis on how Victor Frankenstein perverts the natural order of the world by bringing a dead entity back to life through his experiments. That's a perversion of the natural order. Compare that to someone like Herman Melville with Moby Dick, right? There's no perversion of the natural order in Moby Dick. Nature itself can inspire awe and terror. And man might confront nature and lose, right? Nature taking the form of the white whale, sort of this blankness, horrifying blankness, the abyss of nature, you know, as the philosopher Nietzsche said, right? If you stare too long into the abyss stares back into you. So the Gothic is going to include themes like that. Frequently, the Gothic is going to include elements of the macabre, right? Dead bodies and murder and poison and threats against people, violence, right? Elements of the macabre are much more common inside the Gothic. There tends to be an emphasis on the fear of the unknown. And the unknown in the Gothic could also take the form of the supernatural. Ghosts, vampires, monsters, werewolves, things that feel outside the natural order of the way the world works. There's something else that's highly unique to the Gothic, though, that's not merely something that feels like it could be connected to dark romanticism, but it feels a highly unique characteristic of the Gothic, is that the Gothic really is trying to grapple with what might be thought of as puritanical moral codes. Violations of those codes, but also the influence of those codes on the individual and society. In other words, the moral codes of a puritanical culture are going to lead to perhaps a suppression of darker instincts, and that's going to bubble out. The psychological effects of guilt are common in dark romantic literature, and the Gothic is going to have elements of that as well. But the exploration of how moral codes, like sort of chaos out of order, is a unique characteristic to the Gothic. There's also a strong emphasis on a mood of decay. Things that are in the process of falling apart, right? If the Enlightenment built the cathedrals, the Gothic is the exploration of how those cathedrals start to decay and fall apart. Cathedrals of the mind, literal cathedrals, right? But it's that sense of decay, of a breaking down. And so there are frequently scenes or settings in Gothic literature where the house has been abandoned, or there are sheets over all of the furniture to protect the furniture from dust, or creaky floorboards or broken windows. You can think of other examples of a sort of mood or atmosphere, a setting of decay. The Gothic also really specializes in melodrama, right? Things that are in the text that are going to feel sort of outrageous, or not possible, or highly dramatic. We'll see that when we take a look at the story from Edgar Allan Poe, The Black Cat. The Poe's uses of dashes and exclamation points make it seem like there's high melodrama happening. People who faint and pass out on sofas or chaise lounges. People who there are twists and turns, right? It was my evil twin brother who did it, right? That could feel like a sense of melodrama. Melodrama as a artistic narrative device is sometimes shunned. Sometimes feels like it's cheesy storytelling. But the Romantics loved it. They loved that it felt like it was overdone, highly stylized, bigger than life. Because their whole thought was that the human mind was bigger than life. And it seemed to have so many capabilities, including the melodramatic as a sensibility to it. So we're going to, or I guess maybe the last point that I want to make just before we move into this is that one of the ideas in the Gothic is that the rational cannot overcome the irrational. This might be considered one step further than the Dark Romantics would take something like this. It's not just that sometimes the rational devolves into the irrational, but the Gothics would take it a step further and say the rational can never overcome the irrational. The irrational is sort of, by definition, not something that can ever be overcome. It's always here to stay. We're going to take a look at two short stories that I think are great examples of the Gothic from your anthology. This is the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume B, 10th edition. The texts that we're going to look at include Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story, Rappuccini's Daughter, and Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Black Cat. Let's start with Hawthorne's story. This is on page 359 in the anthology. This is the story of a young academic who falls in love with a mysterious man's daughter. A daughter who seems to be kept locked away in the grounds of this castle, and the atmosphere of mood and decay is prevalent throughout. Look at the image that Hawthorne gives us on page 361, describing the setting of the story. Giovanni still found no better occupation than to look down into the garden beneath his window. From its appearance, he judged it to be one of those botanic gardens, which were of earlier date in Padua than elsewhere in Italy or in the world. Or, not improbably, it might once have been the pleasure place of an opulent family. For there was the ruin of a marble fountain in the center, sculptured with rare art, but so woefully shattered that it was impossible to trace the original design from the chaos of remaining fragments. The water, however, continued to gush and sparkle into the sunbeams as cheerfully as ever. A little gurgling sound ascended to the young man's window and made him feel as if the fountain were an immortal spirit that sung its song unceasingly and without heeding the vicissitudes around it, while one century embodied it in marble and another scattered the garniture on the soil. And we have images of flowers in this garden around this shattered marble fountain. Right? The writers of the Gothic, they don't just set things in a mood of decay or an atmosphere of decay or showing the decay of architecture or the human world. They're using that decay to create foreshadowing, an element of suspense, an element of the spookiness that comes with this moment, or they use it to reflect the sort of broken psychological states of the characters. When Rappuccini himself appears, we get his description further down the page on 361, right? He's a tall, emaciated, sallow, and sickly-looking man, dressed in a scholar's garb of black. He was beyond the middle term of life, with gray hair, a thin gray beard, and a face singularly marked with intellect and cultivation, but which could never, even in his more youthful days, have expressed much warmth of heart. On the top of the next page, 362, furthering the description of this garden, we're told that Rappuccini's, quote, demeanor was that of one walking among malignant influences, such as savage beasts or deadly snakes or evil spirits, which, should he allow them one moment of license, would wreak upon him some terrible fatality. It was strangely frightful to the young man's imagination to see this air of insecurity in a person cultivating a garden, that most simple and innocent of human toils, and which had been alike the joy and labor of the unfallen parents of the race. Was this garden, then, the Eden of the present world, and this man, with such perception of harm in what his own hands caused to grow, was he the Adam? So we have a relationship that Hawthorne's bringing to the surface here, connecting the sort of dilapidated garden and that Rappuccini attends to the Garden of Eden from the Genesis story. Rappuccini's daughter, the daughter of the title of our story, is Beatrice, a name that has important resonances in sort of the darker, more sinister part of literature, in the sense that the most famous Beatrice in all of literature is Dante's love, Beatrice, from the Divine Comedy, the Inferno, the Purgatory, and Paradise, the journey that Dante makes from hell through purgatory up into heaven. Beatrice, the woman that he fell in love with but was never able to marry, is sort of a divine figure who helps him take this journey and helps him find his place after he's sort of lost in a midlife crisis. What I think is interesting about Rappuccini's daughter is two things. One, what happens to our main character, and we'll explore that here in just a moment. But the second, and where I want to start, perhaps just for the time being, is to reflect on why does it matter that Rappuccini is a scholar, that he's an academic, that he's an older man during this particular moment. What does it matter to the story? We have the introduction of a professor character. His name is Pietro Baglioni, and he's a professor to Giovanni, the main character of our story. And Giovanni and these professors, these doctors, are meeting together, and Giovanni raises the question about Rappuccini. And what he hears back is, I think, an important thematic element with the Gothic, but also in the larger sense of how the Romantic era is a rejection of the Enlightenment. At the bottom of page 363, Professor Baglioni is going to tell us a little bit about Rappuccini, and he says, quote, ill would it become a teacher of the divine art of medicine to withhold due and well-considered praise of a physician so eminently skilled as Rappuccini. But on the other hand, I should answer it but scantily to my conscience, were I to permit a worthy youth like yourself, Signor Giovanni, the son of an ancient friend, to imbibe erroneous ideas respecting a man who might hereafter chance to hold your life and death in his hands. The truth is, our worshipful Dr. Rappuccini has as much science as any member of the faculty, with perhaps one single exception in Padua or all Italy. But there are certain grave objections to his professional character. And what are they? Asked the young man. Has my friend Giovanni any disease of body or heart that he is so inquisitive about physicians? Said the professor with a smile. But as for Rappuccini, it is said of him, and I, who know the man well, can answer for its truth, that he cares infinitely more for science than for mankind. His patients are interesting to him only as subjects for some new experiment. He would sacrifice human life, his own among the rest, or whatever else was dearest to him, for the sake of adding so much as a grain of mustard seed to the great heap of his accumulated knowledge. Around the middle of the page, the professor concludes, but to tell you my private mind, Signor Giovanni, he, in reference to Rappuccini, he should receive little credit for such instances of success, they being probably the work of chance, but should be held strictly accountable for his failures, which may justly be considered his own work. There's a sense in which the professor warns Giovanni about the dangers of science run amok, the danger of the Enlightenment taken to its extremes. We saw in our discussion of the Enlightenment the darker side of the way that the mind can be used to justify cruelty. Right? The Enlightenment is not just a period in which liberty and equality and fraternity and other values that nations like the United States get built on are in effect, but it's also a period that continued to subjugate women as second-class citizens in the United States, and an era where people used what they thought were scientific principles. We know them today as junk science, right? Or science driven by bigotry or racism, to put forward justifications for an institution like slavery. The Romantics are able to look back on this era and see the way that science gets abused and turned into or distorted or perverted for the pursuit of knowledge at the cost of humanity. Right? The professor warns Giovanni that Rappuccini himself is a threat, that Giovanni's life might hang in the balance of what Rappuccini is able to do. That Rappuccini would sacrifice any human life, including his own, for the sake of adding so much as a grain of mustard seed to the great heap of his accumulated knowledge. So his pursuit of the truth, of science, of knowledge, of growth, all of these ideas that are venerated and vaulted up in the Enlightenment and are still venerated and vaulted up today, can be taken too far, can be brought into excess. And we should think of this particular short story, but perhaps the Gothic overall, as a corrective on the Enlightenment. When these eras of literature displace one another, it's never that they are fully displacing. the previous era, right? We talked about the fact that the Enlightenment continues to have residual qualities held over from the Puritan era. And the Romantic era has residual elements held over, not only from the Puritan era, but also from the Enlightenment era. When these movements emerge and sort of supersede or replace the dominant mode of thinking or the dominant approach to thinking, they never fully replace it. They build on top of it. But it's important to recognize that what they are often responding to is the dominant mode of thinking taken to an extreme. Rappuccini's Daughter is a cautionary tale of why we need to be mindful of the pursuit of science, why we can't let our pursuit of science derail or make us ignore the humanity of the people around us. And we have to be worried that we might lose our own humanity in that pursuit. That's exactly what happens to Giovanni. But he also sort of represents the other extreme of the Gothic. And so the Gothic has this kind of self-reflective and self-critical style to it as well. Rappuccini is romantic in the lowercase r sense of romance, right? He falls for Beatrice and has to do anything within his power to get close to her. He's not able to see the other side of it, right? There's such a thing as science going too far, but there's also such a thing as losing one's mind so completely, becoming so wrapped up in the emotional experience that we have, that we fail to think through things rationally. Giovanni is warned repeatedly in this text not to get too close to Beatrice. But he does, and it leads to his own ostracizing from society. It leads to her death from the poison, but it also leads to Giovanni himself becoming poisonous. He adopts the same sort of poison in his body and breath that Beatrice has. And then in the efforts to try to save her from Rappuccini, she ends up dying. And so he loses everything as a result of that. So the Gothic is not just trying to say, well, the Enlightenment, you got it wrong, here's the right answer. The Gothic is aware that extremes on both sides are not good. And perhaps the horror of human nature is that we are so tempted or so easily manipulated to go to extremes, to forget the humanity in other people, or to become so wrapped up in our own emotions that we become self-destructive. In the sense that Ahab is self-destructive in Moby Dick. He finally gets his confrontation with the whale, but at what cost? At a tremendous cost. All of the humans who die with him, and of course, himself, dying too. So time is of the essence here, and we need to turn to our second Gothic story that I want us to consider, and that's Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Black Cat. That's on page 620 of your anthology. I could have probably picked any story associated with Poe. Poe is the emblematic Gothic author in American letters. I went with a story that I thought it was perhaps possible that you had not yet encountered, probably because of its violence, right? Lots of people read about Poe, maybe The Telltale Heart, or The Cask of Amontillado, or Murders of the Rue Morgue, or Mask of the Red Death, or Fall of the House of Usher. But my hope is maybe you've never come across The Black Cat before. I think it's a perfect story of the Gothic. It's got full atmosphere of mood and decay and melodrama, the macabre, the supernatural, the horror, the loss of one's mind. Our narrator opens by telling us he's on death row. And he wants to tell us the story, which he knows it's possible that we're not going to believe. But the story basically goes like this. He's married, he's happily married, but he has a vice. His vice is that he's an abusive alcoholic. This abusive behavior when he's drinking leads him to take out some of his aggressions on the animals that he has. And one of the animals that receives the brunt of his violence is his black cat named Pluto. When he's not drunk, he loves Pluto. But after he and Pluto have a violent encounter with each other in which he stabs out the cat's eye, the relationship really begins to deteriorate. And this leads to sort of a full psychological breaking. He kills the cat, and he experiences the destruction of his own house. It burns down, and what burns down is kind of a very cryptic. Everything burns down except this figure of a giant cat. And that implies maybe that there are dangerous or demonic forces that are at play here. He finds a new cat, but then the relationship between him and the new cat sort of begins to deteriorate as well. He ends up, the image on this cat's chest, it's got this white tuft of fur, and the image, the tuft of fur seems to twist over time and create some kind of image. So we have very supernatural elements going on in this story. Eventually, the narrator, his relationship with his wife is deteriorating, and his anger is growing, and his abusiveness is growing, and he eventually murders his wife and hides his wife, disposes of the body by hiding it in the walls. And he ends up getting caught with this. That summary doesn't really do justice to the story, though. And so what I would like to do now, very quickly, is just look at some key excerpts from the story and think about the way those excerpts embody the sense of the Gothic. I want to talk about the recovery or the reflection that our narrator has about his own violent behavior. And this starts at the bottom of page 621. He says, and again, think about this, the rational cannot overcome the irrational. And the way that that's going to factor in here is a thematic element. He writes of the cat in the paragraph at the bottom of 621. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of the creature, which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit, philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue, and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose around its neck and hung it to a limb of a tree. Hung it with tears streaming from my eyes, with the bitterest remorse in my heart. Hung it because I knew it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason for offense. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin, that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. And there's something romantic in that description of God, right? The most merciful and most terrible. Awe and terror. High highs, low lows. He talks in this moment about the way that the mind can become so overwhelmed with a sense of perverseness that it makes you do things that feel like they're outside your control. I want you to think about the symbolism that happens at the end of the story. Poe is very fond of the image of someone being buried alive or locked within a wall or sort of hidden away. And the narrator very rationally walks through what are the possibilities for disposing of his murdered wife's body. And he thinks that anything that he does is going to draw too much attention to it. So he comes up with this plan that he finds brilliant. He's going to wall it up inside the cellar. He's going to build bricks around it and literally lock it away in the cellar. This locking away of the body is a metaphoric idea of suppressing it, hiding it, pressing it down, trying not to let it come out, right? In that sense of the influence of the individual in society trying to follow puritanical moral codes, we're trying to press away the things that we know we shouldn't be doing. That's what the passage of perverseness is talking about. How many times have you done something, he wonders, that's the only reason you did it is because you know you weren't supposed to do it. And so locking up his murdered wife's body is a form of trying to shut away the deed, shut away the sin, shut away the guilt. Right? Now, it paradoxically is his undoing as well. He's so proud of what he has done that he seems unable to control himself. And it almost, in the sense of self-destruction, he almost wants to get caught for the thing that he's done. In the same way that he wants to have his soul be so jeopardized as to be placed outside the bounds of mercy and punishment. Right? But he still wants to be seen for the thing that he's done. So when the police ultimately come to the house to try to find where the missing woman is and if there's any evidence of a murder, he says on the top of page 626, "The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say, if but one word, by way of triumph, and render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness." He wants to get away with the crime that he's committed, but in a weird way, he wants to be caught for the crime that he's committed. He wants the police to know how great his crime was. But there's a paradox in that, right? Which is the police can't find out how great your crime was, and you not get caught. They have to catch you in order to see how you tried to evade them. And it's only after you get caught that they can see that, but you can't have it both ways. And this is a man who really wants it both ways. He wants to give them the impression that he's innocent, but he also wants to be appreciated for how brilliant he is. He says, "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this very well-constructed house," in the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. Notice, losing control of oneself. Right? This is the moment where he's kind of losing control of his ability inside the situation. The irrational is becoming more dominant than the rational here. I may say, an excellently well-constructed house. He's drawing attention to the construction of it. He wants them to acknowledge that it's well-constructed. These walls are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together. Notice in the dialogue here, he says, "Are you going?" They're literally leaving, right? He has gotten away with it, but now he's holding them back. He's trying to hold them back and draw their attention back onto him. An action that he describes as a rabid desire. Scarcely knew what I uttered at all. He's losing control of himself. These walls, are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together, and here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. Right? He's tapping now, drawing the attention to the sound of where he is tapping. But notice, it undoes him. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb. The police stop, turn around, look at the tomb, the brickwork, to hear the sound that's coming from beyond the bricks. And when they finally tear down the bricks to see what that sound is, they find the body of his wife, the corpse of his wife, but they also find the cat that, unbeknownst to the narrator, he had accidentally walled up inside. The cat is his undoing. But also he himself is the practitioner of his own undoing. His murder is done out of anger. But that anger is a fascinating emotion. It's an emotion in which we feel momentarily like we aren't ourselves. But it's an emotion that we also feel like we should be able to control. That's something that the Gothics are very fascinated in. The moments when we seem to not become ourselves. And the Black Cat is a story that's very emblematic of that. Now, you could talk about the role that the alcohol plays in the Black Cat, or you could talk about the role maybe mental illness plays, or perhaps the supernatural and demonic forces that seem to punish the narrator for his violence. But this is ultimately a story, I think, of somebody trying to suppress and not being able to control his suppressions. This is not a story where he simply loses his mind because of alcohol. There's something pre-existing there. The alcohol brings it out. In the same way the fight with the wife brings out his anger and murderous tendencies, and the fact that the alcohol brings out his violent tendencies to the cat, in the way that he's walled the cat up as if he wants to get caught, and he draws attention to himself as if he wishes to get caught. He wants to be understood, But to be understood also because of who he is means to be understood as a criminal, as a murderer, as someone who's violent and behaves in cruel ways. So Rappuccini's Daughter and the Black Cat, I think, are both very emblematic of the Gothic tradition. And I hope by understanding the principles and ideas, the styles, the motifs, the elements of the Gothic, we can see the way that they're on display inside the stories in our anthology. We're going to turn now toward the light. And we're going to discuss transcendentalism as a movement within the Romantic era that is in many respects the opposite of the Gothic, and wants to explore the higher faculties of the mind, but also the mind's relationship to nature and the mind's understanding of how the natural existence of the human is not one that's highly orchestrated around science and progress, but one that's organized around a perception of the self and a perception or an understanding of how the self fits into the overall framework of society. So we move to the Transcendentalists next time.